Hello and welcome to the Agora Politics podcast. This is your host, Alex Murshak. Today I'm speaking with Justin Murphy. Justin is a political scientist, political theorist, podcaster, author, blogger, and all-around extremely prolific online personality. Justin is also the host of the Other Life podcast, and you can find his writing as well as more of his work and thoughts over at theotherlifenow.com. We talk about his new book, Based Deleuze, the man Deleuze himself, what it means to be based, and Justin's interpretation of why Deleuze is based, according to his book, the Deleuzian concept of lines of flight, disciplinary versus control societies, Libertarian Communism, and Diogenes and his concept of defacing the currency. Justin was gracious enough to give us a good bit of his time here, as well as do some thinking in real time on this episode. So strap in, it's going to be a whirlwind. And now, without further ado, I give you Justin Murphy. Hello and welcome to the Agora Politics podcast. This is Alex Murshak. My guest today is Justin Murphy. Justin has a very, very interesting set of experiences. Currently, he is a podcaster, live streamer, author, goes by a number of other titles. Justin, do you want to introduce yourself real quick to the audience?
Yeah, sure. If you prefer, yeah, sure. I am a political theorist and political scientist, and I recently left my academic career. I was a professor for more than 5 years. I decided to jump ship to go full-time on the internet, and I've been doing that for a little bit less than a year now.
Great. And I actually, oddly enough, I recently spoke with Jason Snyder and Jared Janes over at the Both And podcast. And so in preparation for talking to you today, I went ahead and listened to the episode that you did with them, I think back in November, just to see sort of, what you guys chatted about. My listeners haven't had a chance to hear that episode yet. It'll be coming out actually this week. But one of the things that I was happy to learn, I'm pretty sure it was on that podcast, was to just get a little bit of background from them or from your conversation with them on the auspices under which you ended up leaving academia. And I'm only bringing this up just because I want to pay you a huge compliment here, which is that, in my view, you're actually one of the few people that I can think of who is truly living out the life of an intellectual, in that you've devoted yourself entirely to more or less making it economically viable for yourself to do your intellectual pursuits. So I totally applaud you for that.
Oh, well, thank you so much for the kind words. It's nice to be understood and appreciated. That means a lot to me. Okay,
so now recently you have this new ebook out, correct? Based Deleuze.
Yeah, that's right, and soon to be paperback in just a day or two. Actually, it should be available on Amazon.
Great. So I would definitely recommend that anyone who is hearing this to go out and get his book, particularly when it comes out on paperback. It's hard to get a book out on paperback, and it's really a big accomplishment. I know that this is just your first salvo. I'm sure there'll be a number of other books forthcoming. You're an extremely prolific thinker and prolific writer and online personality in general, so I'm sure you've got a lot to say.
Sure, let's get to it.
Yeah, so now my audience is not exactly necessarily composed of political science people, political theorists. We have political theory as sort of the intellectual substrate from which our base of operations starts. But I just wanted to, if you could briefly give the audience an update on or I guess just a brief bio on who Deleuze is, and then we can get into your book a little bit.
Okay, yeah, sure. Happy to do that. So Gilles Deleuze is quite popular, I would say, at the moment. He's quite hot, quite fashionable French philosopher, and his life spanned the better part of the 28th century. He died in 1995, I believe, and was an active philosopher in France for several decades, especially in kind of the mid to late 20th century.
Yeah. Sorry. Continue.
No, okay. I was just gonna, no problem. You can jump in if you want to, but I was just going to give a little bit of background on his life.
Please do.
Yeah. One of the interesting features of his biography is that his parents were very conservative, and a lot of people don't know this. And something from the political science literature, this is something that I seize on in Base Deleuze, is that political orientation is at least partly heritable. So, I wouldn't oversell this point. Just because your parents are reactionaries doesn't mean you're necessarily going to be a reactionary. But it's just an interesting little data point that, one of the many biographical features of Gilles Deleuze that just pretty much nobody talks about. But I take that as quite interesting. His parents were actually fascists, more or less. They were voters for the Croix de Feu, which was the basically a kind of French version of something like Mussolini's party or Hitler's party. It was not quite as kind of insane and bad as Mussolini or Hitler's parties, but it was pretty much in that, what political scientists will call party families. It's that type of party. And his parents were sympathetic to them. Now, Deleuze was a leftist by most indications, so I don't deny that. But there are all these interesting little data points in his life and even in his writings that have weirdly reactionary kind of connotations or implications. And that's kind of a jumping point. That's a jumping off point for the book. So yeah, that's one could say many things about his biography, but pretty much he's known as a post-structuralist, which is often associated with postmodernism. But something I argue in the book is that these two terms really have to be distinguished. I would say that Deleuze was not a postmodern, although he was a post-structuralist. And for people who are listening who might not know what that means, post-structuralism really just refers to the philosophical tendencies that come after structuralism, which was the overwhelmingly kind of popular, dominant kind of French mode of philosophical thought before people like Deleuze. So people like Claude Levi-Strauss, or Louis Althusser. These are famous structuralists. And structuralism is pretty much what it sounds like. It's an approach to social theory in which you understand the different various social phenomena as structures that recur in different times and places. And then people like Derrida and Deleuze disrupt this famously and tend to focus on how this stable recurring structures that seem to define society are not in fact the most interesting objects of attention, and that in fact it's the way that structures are slippery and often unstable that becomes the focus of people like Derrida and Deleuze. So that's a reasonable way to just very briefly kind of put Deleuze in a very kind of simple, cartoonish context in the 20th century history of philosophy. But he's very, very unique and quite strange, famously obscure. His writings are famously difficult. And the general consensus in academia is that he's a left-wing kind of anarchist, communist, post-structuralist thinker and philosopher. And the point of Base Deleuze was to really poke a bunch of holes in that overly comfortable consensus. He's not at all, in my opinion, a straightforward leftist, although he definitely had a leftist temperament in some ways, and throughout his life he did express solidarity with the working class, and in many ways he was a leftist, but in many other ways he wasn't. And I think that this is generally true of all great thinkers. They really rarely map on to these simple ideological coordinates.
That was fantastic. And I'm really glad that you brought up those key points about how you view that he's differentiated from other French intellectuals who might be in the post-structuralist cohort, with regard especially to his critiques of the left. And really quickly, I just wanted to, so there's some clarification on this. I know you get asked this question a lot, but my readers probably haven't heard you explain it before. What do you mean by based?
So based is a really interesting word. Like many memes on the internet, it has gone through different cycles of meaning and has meant different things to different people at different times. It was, to my knowledge, pretty much launched as a popular term by the rapper Lil B.
Yeah.
Lil B, the based god.
Yeah,
the
Lil
based
B.
god was, yeah, his nickname was the based god.
Mm-hmm.
And, Lil B's message, his whole demeanor was always, to him, based seemed to suggest a kind of just simple, nice, positive attitude, essentially. And, being happy, being kind, being generally positive, in a nutshell, is what based meant to Lil B. Being grateful, being supportive, constructive. It really, almost a quite trite meaning. Nothing too fancy. But that was always Lil B's demeanor and his general message. And I think that's what based meant in his context. Somehow it later gets picked up by right wingers on the internet, like frog Twitter folks,
Mm-hmm.
alt-right types. And it, in that context, it basically is opposed to cringe. There's this dichotomy or dualism between that which is cringe and that which is based. And so frog Twitter says, all the woke lefties and all that stuff, and the stuff that normies and NPCs are interested, all of that stuff is what they call cringe and blue pilled. And then all the stuff that frog Twitter and the alt-right people like, for instance, Trump and, free speech crusaders and troll, badass, funny trolls who don't give a shit about what normal society thinks about them. All of that is based and red-pilled. So this distinction between cringe and blue-pilled and based and red-pilled is very kind of prominent to a certain pocket of the web at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And I use based in a way that is a kind of a combination of those two. And I think that this is what is so cool about meme culture and why the internet is so interesting and fun and attractive for creative intellectuals, is that by definition, memes, their meaning shifts rapidly all the time. That's kind of their defining characteristic. And so if I use the word based, perhaps I'm going to use it in a different way. I'm going to put a unique twist on it. You can't say that I'm not signaling that I'm a member of frog Twitter, because I'm not.
Right.
I'm not signaling that I support, any of the stupid stuff that alt-right people support. I'm not. But I am nonetheless mimetically participating in a weird tradition. Tradition is kind of a really heavy word to describe something like the history of a meme or the evolution of a meme. But nonetheless, I'm pretty much taking this signifier and I'm twisting it in my own way. And so it pretty much, the way that I use it has connotations of those two main kind of previous uses. So in my understanding, then, based is just grounded, real, honest, radically authentic, and direct, and unconcerned with social opinion, unconcerned with all of the highfalutin nonsense of sophisticated people and overeducated people, and basically all the noise that lots of people get very fixated on or infatuated with. Being based means being outside of the noise, turning off all the noise, not caring about the noise of popular opinion or sophisticated, educated, fashionable practices. Being based is just doing what you believe in doing and nothing else, standing on your own 2 feet and nothing else, being radically, grounded in a way. And so this is kind of similar to Lil B It has a similar kind of connotation or message, but it's also kind of similar to a little bit to the frog Twitter usage, because this does, in my understanding, based does always mean you're constantly saying things that break the rules of polite society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So obviously, Deleuze was very much immersed in the French left-wing intellectual milieu of his day. It's not like he was himself necessarily an outcast. But in what ways would you say that he is different from his cohort? And in particular, I know you've brought up before his, I guess, unique critique or perhaps warnings to members of the left that have to do with this concept of staying grounded. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. Well, it's a good question. How would you primarily distinguish Deleuze from his contemporaries? Well, part of me does want to answer. Part of me wants to say I'm not sure that I have a particularly interesting or sophisticated answer to this, but my instinct would be that I do think there's something kind of unique about Deleuze in his real idiosyncratic individualism. I don't mean political individualism. I mean just his actual nature or temperament, and his ability to go down, what he would call lines of flight in really quite creative and aggressive ways that really don't map back to anything normal or currently existing. His capacity to, gradually and progressively go further and further away from what is normal or what is even, interpretable or legible. So I do think he was unique in that regard.
So lines of flight actually is a Deleuzian term. Do you want to explain that really quick? I know you've noted before that he's notorious for introducing this whole lexicon that allowed him to sort of sneak concepts in to the field in a time when people were being very, very obtruse that might not have otherwise been easily digestible within his own in-group.
Right. So I do think that's what he was doing, and the line of flight is one of the kind of most important concepts in his joint work with Felix Guattari, where they talk about the line of flight as it's pretty much the escape or exit from that which is always trying to domesticate you, always trying to channel you and capture you. And, there are these kind of phenomena of capture everywhere. I mean, even just being a member of a friend group, you're a college student, for instance. If maybe some of your listeners are college students, you learn very quickly, right, in a kind of college setting. In certain groups, as you're making friends in college, there are just certain ideas and words and practices that are cool, and then there are others that are not. And there is a very strong kind of automatic, immediate pressure that you feel in your mind and your body to say certain things that are liked and not say other things that are not liked. And so they're very interested in how our society and social phenomena in general, from small groups up to big groups and governments and everything, all along that continuum, there's so many processes, very strong processes, that are essentially containing and narrowing down what it is possible for us to even think or say or do. And they're really interested in how we can decode those phenomena of capture that so radically constrain what it's possible for us to think and say and do. They're interested in how can we decode those capture processes such that then we can bust open brand new, wide open vistas of experimentation and creativity in the vast domain of what is possible, but is unfortunately always socially kind of prohibited or constrained. And the line of flight is kind of their key concept that defines the vector through which individuals can escape these processes of capture and find these new open vistas of experimentation possibility. And so they try to theorize like how to do that essentially. And so there's a rich kind of whole set of discourses and elaborations on this basic concept of the line of flight. And we could spend a whole hour trying to kind of unpack that, and that's something we could do if you wanted to. But the basic idea of the line of flight is you find. Here's how I would summarize it.
Sure.
One of the key things to understand about the line of flight is that it's all about affect. It's about, when you feel forces of capture constraining you and domesticating you, you can usually feel also inside of you. You feel a kind of calling to some other thing. It excites you. It stimulates you. Maybe there's a book in the library, or maybe there's a blogger on the internet who your friends say it's very naughty. You're not supposed to read that blogger.
Yeah, don't listen to Justin Murphy. He's dangerous.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Whatever the case might be. You can always feel inside of yourself an affective charge, a kind of affective attraction to different things in your immediate local environment. And it could be some writer or some book in the library, but it also could be something amazingly simple, like ridiculously simple. And they give a lot of examples of this. It could be like, you go for a walk one afternoon and you see something down an alley that's kind of strange. And then you go down that alley, and then it leads to some other thing that's strange. They give this example of, they use an example from like Virginia Woolf novel, I think, about walking, for instance. And they give a bunch of other examples. It can be, there's no telling in advance what it's going to be, but pretty much the logic of the line of flight is that you are constantly, through your senses and your affects, you are constantly, if you pay attention, being called out of genuine interest and attraction. You find joy in pursuing weird little things that are off the map of what other people even think about or understand or can even interpret. And what they're trying to tell us, I believe, is those are the most precious and important features of life for any kind of creative person or intellectual person or political revolutionary, anyone who's interested in finding freedom and increasing liberation in the world, that these micro movements of affect that point us towards vectors moving away from that which is normal and that which is kind of socially captured, that this is the line of flight. They say pursue that line of flight where your affect leads you. Pursue that line of flight, and I could try to tell you much more about this if this is something that you're interested in. But I think that would suffice as a kind of short summary of the line of flight.
Well, that was absolutely beautiful, and actually that helped me get a more comprehensive understanding of it as well. It's more than just spontaneity or breaking out of social conditioning. It's actually more like a deep self-knowledge and a willingness to really genuinely perceive the world that's in front of you.
Yes, that's right. Well put. And that's an important observation that you just made, because a lot of people do have this impression that Deleuzian, creativity is essentially this kind of naive postmodern creativity, like anything goes, like as if they just wrote Capitalism and Schizophrenia, their 2-volume work, probably their most famous, 2 books, as if it was just kind of like wild, chaotic, imagination and scribbling of, diagrams and such. Like this is kind of what's rotten about postmodernism, and that's not at all what they're doing. They're not saying that the line of flight is any possible crazy thing just to be ridiculous for the sake of being ridiculous or something like that. Which is frankly how some people seem to kind of try to practice a Deleuzian kind of ethics or lifestyle, as if just, you need to be randomly chaotic, and that's like really cool and hip and fashionable. That's going to be like a Deleuzian way to escape, the codes of capture. It's not that at all. In fact, and so you're absolutely right to pick up on that. It's actually a very rigorous and disciplined obedience to reality, because when you go on that walk and you see something down some alley and you start going down that alley and then you pursue where it leads, one thing after another, it's not random. It's not at all some kind of like, simple, random, chaotic process. It's you're paying attention to what your affects are processing in the world, and you're being obedient and you're submitting to what reality is actually calling forth.
Yeah, and do you see following through a line of flight almost as a compulsion, as itself an act of faith, and how is this related to Deleuze's conception of religion or
That's a really
transcendence?
good, yeah, that's a really good point. I do think that there's a faith component in all of this because when you go down the line of flight, you don't know where it's going to go. By definition, you don't know where it's going to go because by definition, it's outside of the grid of current established intelligibility. So in a way, you are trusting your affects, but it's not really rational to trust your affects. It usually it leads to highly unpredictable and unexpected outcomes. It's you know, and it's often not what you think you want, right? So it really is a kind of wager that is not fully justified by a rational calculus, and
Mm-hmm.
that essentially is what faith is on some level. So I think that's an astute observation that you made. I'm not even sure that I make that precise connection in the book, but in the book I do talk about the kind of strange religious dimension in Deleuze, in particular the Christian dimension. And here I pretty much am just cribbing from work by Peter Hallward, who wrote a book called Out of This World, and it's really quite a unique and interesting book. My hat is off to Peter Hallward. It's quite yeah, I think creative and interesting, and somewhat against the grain interpretation of Deleuze as essentially a kind of religious thinker, as in particular as a kind of mystical thinker. Hallward thinks that Deleuze's philosophy is really genuinely pointing to a kind of otherworldly worldview, and I think it's true. I think it's very well put. And I kind of dig through, and based Deleuze, I dig through some of the other aspects of his life and of his work that I think are quite interesting in this regard. He did actually roll with some kind of Catholics in France at the time. When he was young, in fact, he had a mentor, and there was this kind of like highbrow kind of socialite Catholic lady named Magdalene Davy. I think I'm forgetting the name. That's a slightly incorrect, but you can find it in the book. And this woman was actually a scholar of Catholicism, and she was a Catholic herself. And Deleuze would go to her salon, and there were other Catholics there also. And people also, something people in the West today, I'm sorry, Anglo people in 2020,
Sure.
who are interested in continental philosophy. What a lot of people don't understand today, like students today, don't understand is, in France and countries such as Spain, Catholicism was way more influential than really anyone knows or remembers or can understand today. So, for someone who came of age at the time that Deleuze came of age, Catholicism was way more just in the air, way more normal, way more powerful and effective as a kind of cultural force, whether you subscribe to it or not. So Deleuze did identify as an atheist, to be clear about this. That's why Hallward's interpretation is quite interesting, and why mine kind of pushes that envelope even further. So I'll be straightforward about that. He does identify as an atheist, but when you look at his life, you realize, this is actually someone who's kind of relatively suffused in a Catholic environment, is quite kind of friendly with and influenced by certain Catholics, and I do think that in a really interesting and very roundabout way, he is pretty much, whether he even knows it or not, I'm not sure, but he's pretty much recapitulating a kind of very Christian philosophy and ultimately rather socially conservative philosophy. Because if you look at his life, he was actually, a very simple man. He didn't travel much. He even talks about this, how, he and Guattari say, and, the nomad never travels. The nomad has no need to travel. The nomad is so nomad that he has no need to travel. He's not running around, sleeping around. He's not, looking for liberation in the form of, a variety of pleasures and this kind of naive attitude that liberation is sometimes associated with. He stays in one place. Deleuze lived in the suburbs his whole life, had one wife, had kids, didn't really ever do anything particularly interesting. Lived a very, very simple, very based life. Exactly. And, it's a very based attitude. It's a very Christian attitude. It's actually reminiscent of someone like Chesterton. I don't think I cite Chesterton in the book, but Chesterton says extremely similar things about how nomads don't travel and how actually it's the based Christian who just focuses on, the people around him and works hard and, stays in one place and with his feet on the ground in a humble attitude, that this person is actually the one who has the most expansive and rich, set of creative and intellectual possibilities, precisely because they're focused and they're based and they're submitting to this kind of Christian simplicity and humility. So I think you see that exact thing, that exact idea in not only Deleuze's ideas, but also in his life.
Fantastic. Now, I'm going to shift gears a little bit here and move more into less focus on Deleuze's autobiographical characteristics and get a little bit into the theory side of things. So one of the essays that I read in preparation for this show that you've referenced a number of times in other interviews and in your own videos is this little piece called Postscript on the Societies of Control. It's a short piece, but it does a really good job of explaining how the ways and really if for someone that hasn't read Deleuze, it's not a bad place to start. Explaining where Deleuze takes off from the ideas of Foucault and getting into really the meat of where his theory is at, because I think it's something that's really relevant to us today. I think readers living in the 21st century might have even resonated with it better than perhaps the people who would have been reading it at the time he wrote it, I believe in 1991. So do you want to go over just the cleavage here of disciplinary versus control societies and get into that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. If you'd like me to, I'm happy to. So, Foucault is very famous for his diagnosis of what he calls disciplinary societies, and the institutions associated with what he calls discipline or disciplinary societies are pretty much the big, huge institutions that define, our memory, at least, of society as it was from the 20th century back down into the 19th century and the 18th century to some degree as well. So the school system, the prison system, the factory system, the medical hospital systems, these big institutions that pretty much grow out of the more or less kind of industrial process. It's sort of all downstream from industrialization. So what these disciplinary institutions have in common is that they're large. They process individuals as numbers, so think of like when you enter a prison, you're given a number and then you're assigned to a cell which has a number. And the prison is essentially a kind of assembly line of punished people. It's like the penal version of the factory, of the industrial factory. If you're working in a industrial factory, you sit at a particular desk and you do one task in this complex assembly line, and you do that one thing over and over again. You're just one number in this very large cog, this very large machine. You're one cog in a very large machine. You're relatively fixed, you're monitored, and you just basically follow through on that. And that's pretty much all there is to it. And you go in and out of these institutions in a fairly discrete way, right? So, the classical, what Foucault, it's kind of confusing because Foucault calls the age of disciplinary societies the classical age, which is kind of strange because most people would think of other things when they think of classical, but Um, we'll just call it the kind of the age of disciplinary institutions, or the age of disciplinary societies. In this age, you go in and out of these various disciplinary institutions. So if you're sent to jail, then you enter this massive monolithic system, this assembly line for punishment, and you go through the famous, panopticon. This is where that concept of the panopticon comes in. The structuring, the architectural structuring of prisons. There's this famous design, which is essentially circular, and the prison guards sit in the middle of it, and they can see all the way around, so they can see into all of the cells of the prison. But the kind of genius of this architectural design is that if you're a prisoner in one of these prison cells, you probably aren't actually being looked at by the prison guard at any given moment, but because you could be, it effectively is able to kind of enforce a kind of monitoring and enforce a discipline on these prisoners that is kind of rationally multiplied. It's multiplied through a kind of application of rationality to previously, pre-modern, less than rational arrangements. And so the panopticon is probably Foucault's kind of most famous symbol of the disciplinary institutions or disciplinary society. It's essentially the rationalization of these various kind of social functions. And in any event, what I was saying was, that was a bit of a digression. What I was saying was just that you go in and out of them, and so when you're in them, you're in them, but then when you're out of them, you're out of them.
Right.
That's another kind of defining.
It's an enclosure with a discrete interior and exterior.
Yeah, that's a very nice addition. Exactly. And so, yeah, you can think of the same thing as school, right? Like when you go, and what's interesting to note is that for most of these institutions, I'm 33, and so I'm not that old, and yet I grew up mostly with, I think, the kind of the tail end of these institutions in a lot of ways. It's really only in the past 20, 30, 50 years maybe that we're really looking at the end of this kind of disciplinary society that Foucault described and analyzed in so many different of its subdomains. And what Deleuze argues in the postscript is, he says that Foucault's analyses are no longer true. He says that digital society or digital culture is essentially making Foucault's analyses no longer relevant. And then he kind of introduces a bunch of distinctions about what's new in the new digital age. And all of a sudden, what he says is that, these disciplinary institutions, they're all being fragmented. They're all way more flexible now. It's unclear where the inside starts and where the outside starts. You're kind of in multiple of them at the same time. An example would be like, you're not either in prison or out of prison. Now there's all kinds of complicated parole arrangements, or you might be out of prison, but you have an ankle bracelet that monitors your whereabouts for years after you leave prison. If you think about school, for instance, think of like you're essentially preparing to go to university from the time that you're like in first grade nowadays, because if you don't get into the enrichment classes in third grade, then that's going to decrease your probability of getting into pre-calc in eighth grade. And if you don't get into pre-calc in eighth grade, then you're not going to be able to get trigonometry done by your junior year in high school. And if you're not able to get trigonometry done in your junior year of high school, then you're not going to be able to get into AP classes in your senior year. And if you're not able to get into senior AP classes in your senior year, then you're not going to get into Harvard. And if you're not going to get into Harvard, you're not going to make really good money. And so in all of these weirdly connected and fluid ways, all of these formerly discrete institutions now have their beginning points and ending points stretched out much more, so that it's all overlapping, it's all fluid. And the argument that I make, which is kind of, I guess, my somewhat unique interpretation or gloss on this, is that it's essentially what he's actually really talking about is all downstream of the information revolution. He doesn't say this exactly, but it's a certain set of discoveries that was made at a fairly discrete point in time in the middle of the 20th century, where scientists discovered what the nature of information is. And it's only because of that we get things like the internet and the explosion of information technology that we're all living through. So essentially what Deleuze is saying is that it's the information revolution itself, which is now making all of these former disciplinary functions, these large, massive disciplinary control structures, are now being chopped up and made much more efficient, much more effective, precisely thanks to digitalism in particular. The digital revolution is what is really at the bottom of it, I think, according to Deleuze. He doesn't say that exactly, but that's my reading of it.
Yeah, I think he summarizes it as machines based on computation rather than energy is sort of the split that he draws. That's maybe not as precise as it could be. One of the things that I keep thinking about, it's been referenced before by, I believe, Eric Weinstein, is that post-World War II, which happens to be the focus for Deleuze in the postscript as well, as sort of when the shift starts happening. We have Watson and Crick, who uncover the double helix structure of the human genetic code, the genome. And at the same time, of course, due to code breaking efforts during that same war, we have the rise of computation. And so this idea that we sort of discovered, as you said, what information really was. And now we're in the process of sort of transforming society from, or even our conceptions of what it is that we're doing, from discrete objects or particles into a sort of wave. Deleuze in the paper talks about his example is surfing, right? The popularity of surfing as an example of this. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about you as a thinker, and I think it's even more interesting that you happen to write this book on Deleuze, is that you seem to me to be somebody that's taken his philosophy and really truly integrated it in terms of this question of how you should live your life. You, as far as I know, your career is almost based entirely on over information-based media. That is, you're using the existing infrastructure of computers, computation, the internet, all sorts of web tools, and private corporations that have created these tools as well, not to mention all of the public funding that went into getting it going in the first place. You're now taking this control structure that you're embedded in, and you're actually using it to promote yourself and as a means for your own liberation. Would you agree with that interpretation?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's really what Deleuze is getting at. I mean, in the postscript, he doesn't say very much about it, so it's somewhat enigmatic, but he pretty much says that he thinks the most promising places to look for liberation in the context of what he calls control societies, that's his term for it, kind of digital contemporary Western societies. He says the place to look for liberation in this context is what he calls jamming, piracy, and viruses. He doesn't really explain that as much as we'd like him to, but I think that essentially what I'm trying to do in my own life is an application of this injunction or suggestion. And yeah, it is essentially a matter of using contemporary digital kind of cybernetic processes, which are highly liable to kind of suppress us and control us in increasingly flexible and fluid and difficult to escape ways, using these digitalized cybernetic processes to bootstrap our own novel lines of flight in even more aggressive and effective ways. I do think that's essentially what he's suggesting by these concepts of jamming, piracy, and viruses. It's essentially creative interventions into the cybernetic control structures that lead to your own empowerment and and the empowerment and liberation of you and your friends who creatively embark on lines of flight. And then I think you can turn to his other writings and in particular the joint work with Guattari to try to tease out what exactly that means. I think those books are filled with lots of pointers on what exactly that means and what exactly it looks like. And that is essentially what I'm trying to figure out experimentally through my own life. That's right.
Great. And now, I guess, whoops, I don't know if you heard that. I want to turn quickly to give the audience a little bit of insight into who you are as a thinker as well. You describe yourself, just because I believe it dovetails very nicely with this point here. You describe yourself as a libertarian communist. Is that a correct characterization?
Sure.
Okay. And now when people hear the word communist or when they hear the word libertarian, those are relatively loaded terms. As signifiers, they probably carry with them a lot of assumptions that might not be applicable to the exact way in which you're using those terms. Do you want to just
Sure.
briefly describe your ideological position with regard to those two terms? Because I think it's actually really important for what I see as your public-facing project, which is basically turning your life's work into some form of a public good.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I'm happy to. I'll start by saying that I think ideological labels are just so scrambled right now that, I wouldn't really encourage anyone to put too much stock into these words or care too much about these words personally. And I tend to think that for true intellectuals, there is really very little need to even think very much about these terms. I think an honest intellectual should just be seeking the truth as explosively as possible, and then let other people decide if you're a leftist or a rightist or whatever. It's just not interesting to a genuine intellectual, because you pursue the truth wherever it leads, and maybe it'll lead to some things on the left, it'll lead to some things on the right. The whole point of the radical intellectual life is that you don't really care where it leads. Where it leads is where it leads, and that's reality, and you just you are faithful to that and let the chips fall where they may. So that's just a bit of a preface, but I still do sometimes use these terms just because these ideological labels, just because people are kind of obsessed with ideology, and things are our Western societies are very polarized along ideological and party lines. So they remain powerful signifiers. And so, yeah, people want to know, people ask. So I think libertarian communist is as good a summary as any. And, so people who might not be familiar, there's a certain tradition of libertarian communism. For people on the kind of normal left, it means a certain thing. Think of like the Spanish Revolution and, people like Derrida and, it's basically a very kind of libertarian communism or libertarian socialism is pretty much a combination of anarchism and strong egalitarianism or communism. So pretty much the idea is that you have a vision of strong communism, but you don't want to impose it on anyone through state structures, right? So it would be kind of opposed to, it would be kind of, you can think of it as the opposite of Leninism or Stalinism. It's the idea of building real communism, but through decentralized liberation of creative energies and potentials at a grassroots level. The idea is that if you do that well and militantly and effectively, you can kind of grow communism from the ground up by just simply empowering working class people and poor people, empowering them more and more, and creating a culture where people from the grassroots level are able to be more and more creative and take more power for themselves away from state, and corporate institutions. And then that's pretty much just a quick cartoon summary of what libertarian communism means to most people. It is a kind of recognized kind of left-wing tradition. For me, I'm sympathetic to that, and it does basically still describe my orientation. I mean, that is essentially what I'm interested in, is how can we have maximum redistribution, absolute kind of equality of access to resources. which to me, at its logical endpoint, is essentially what communism denotes. But I want to do it in, I would never personally subscribe to or sign up for anything that would use force. I think basically an honest and ethical communist has to have a kind of very bright line, a bright prohibition on any way that would try to achieve communism or socialism through any force whatsoever. And I think as long as you don't want to impose anything on anyone, then you're never going to, find yourself in the horrors of the 20th century of, Stalinism or whatnot. So yeah, that still describes me. I guess I'm a little bit different because I do have somewhat certain social conservative attitudes, and so I guess in a nutshell, I would say it's kind of paradoxical, but I'm quite sympathetic to certain types of severe social control, but my unique twist is that it should be voluntary. So I don't want to impose in other words, I don't want to impose anything on anyone. In that way, I'm a libertarian. Mm-hmm. But I think people should impose things on themselves. In that way, I'm a somewhat social authoritarian in certain dimensions. But in my view, if it's voluntary, then there's really nothing fascist about it or at all, bad about it. So I tend to have socially conservative opinions when it comes to things like porn and sex work and abortion and, these types of, social issues. I'm not very hard line about, I'm not some kind of I don't go to abortion centers and protest and shit. At the end of the day, I'm kind of like a milquetoast liberal. I kind of, I'm happy for I in practice is what I'm saying. I'm kind of uncomfortable with abortion. I think it's way more difficult and vexing and troublesome as a philosophical and political question than anyone on the left wants to admit. But I'm not, protesting abortion centers. I don't really know. I have a lot of kind of healthy uncertainty about these things. And in practice, when it comes to these issues, I'm a milquetoast liberal. At the end of the day, I don't lose any sleep at night from lots of abortions taking place. And I don't lose sleep at night knowing that, lots of people watch porn. And I'm not trying to go on some crusade to actually stop these things. So in practice, I'm milquetoast liberal on those things. But in my attitudes and opinions and philosophical political judgments, I tend to be socially conservative. So that makes it weird for me to be a libertarian communist. But this is why kind of the unique, I guess, political philosophy that I'm kind of developing in some of my recent writings, on my blog is, and certainly in a future book, is that I think the real way to have libertarian communism is by groups of people learning to be brutally austere and authoritarian on themselves. Mm-hmm. That, to me, is the magic solution. And I think it makes perfect sense, and people haven't really thought this through at all yet.
You've been
if you want to have communism.
You've been compared. You've been compared to Jordan Peterson in that regard, with the emphasis on self-efficacy and personal responsibility.
Yeah, you could say that in certain way. I mean, I talk about Jordan Peterson in the Deleuze book, which infuriates people, but yeah, there's something there. Basically, I for any workable communism, there does need to be enforcement mechanisms, right? I mean, that I think that's beyond dispute. So the ideal vision would be one in which, imagine political community in which everyone is absolutely free. People can choose to do whatever they want. They can come in and out. They can join the commune or they can leave the commune. But so long as they're in the commune, they have to enforce certain things on themselves. If they don't enforce certain behaviors on themselves, then they are excluded from the commune. But if they do enforce certain behaviors on themselves, then they remain in the commune. And to me, this is the perfect way to solve the tension between, libertarian communism on the one hand, right? The problem with libertarian communism is no one's been able to make it work, right? There are tons of libertarian communists. There have been tons of libertarian communist projects, and none of them have actually produced an equilibrium that we would recognize as successful, achieved communism. And that's because it probably relies on a kind of unrealistically hopeful attitude about how people are just going to automatically bootstrap themselves into a voluntary kind of communist equilibrium. Turns out that probably doesn't work. It's what I would prefer. That's kind of the ideal hope, but it turns out that probably doesn't work. And then on the other hand, people who actually are concerned with making communism work, those are the people who end up being somewhere on a continuum with someone like Stalin.
So to authoritarian tendencies.
Yeah, exactly. So it's either you're not enforcing rules enough, libertarian communism, or you're enforcing rules too much, authoritarian communism. And to me, there is actually a viable kind of third way. That's a very unpopular term, and I don't mean it in the way it's usually used. But there is a kind of third type of communism, let's say, that solves this puzzle by basically making the commune a voluntary polity, voluntary system, and so long as you're enforcing certain requisite behaviors on yourself, then you remain in the redistribution network of communism. But if you're unable to enforce them on yourself, then you're excluded from the redistribution mechanism. And yeah, I mean, I don't think many people have really ever thought much about this or thought or written much about this. But I have a few blog posts on the record now about this and developing this, and I genuinely think it's a really promising way to think about it. That's just terribly underexplored.
Great. And so I've got a few more questions for you here before we reach the end of our time. One of your pinned tweets at the top of your profile right now talks about, it sort of gives a 2-minute presentation of what you think is sort of the shortest TLDR of Deleuze's philosophy possible, according to yourself. And I know you're a fan of Diogenes, who's the notorious Greek philosopher who sort of hung around in a barrel and in the open market and, you know, went around harassing people and urinating in public and sort of just generally dispensing with all social norms or regard for customs of polite society. And you talk about in this post the concept of defacing the currency. Do you want to tell me what you think that means a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So an interesting connection here to start is that Deleuze talks about in the postscript, he talks about how, you know, in the control societies, contemporary digital societies, as opposed to Foucault's traditional disciplinary societies, in control societies today, it has the image one should have in one's mind of how control operates is like exchange rates. He uses exchange rates as an example. And this is very interesting and useful for us as we try to think about what Diogenes meant when he talks about exchange, you know, defacing the currency. You can see this in society today, right? Like even on a college campus, I'll make all my examples about college since I'm in college. You know, you see certain ideas and fashions go up and down in terms of their stock price, right? Certain words become cool to say. And if you say a certain word, you get, you know, a higher reward in the social perceptions of people around you. But then some other word goes out of fashion. And, if you use that word, you know, your stock price goes down. This is, I think, what Deleuze is talking about when he talks about kind of the prevalence of exchange rates. Everything now is so fluid, right? So everything from words to clothing to practices to behaviors to how you walk to how you think to what you do with your life to what you create to what you write. All of those things are now on these highly fluid markets, highly fluid exchange rates. So the price of something, kind of the social price, and here price is understood in the most general way, right? So it can be money, but it can also be just social valuation, like what's cool, what's hip. Those pricing mechanisms are now extremely distributed, extremely decentralized and fluid and efficient, right? Because we have things like social media, right? We have all of these fast-paced digital technologies that connect us and allow for the movement of information to take place so much faster. That's essentially why this is the case. That's what's at the bottom of this. So now everything we think and say and do is on these highly fluid exchange markets, essentially, where the price of things, the stock price of things, can go way up in one day, right, with a viral sensation, or can go way down in one day if it's, quote unquote, canceled, right? This is what we're seeing today, with meme culture and with cancel culture and all of this, is a kind of just later stage of what Deleuze is diagnosing in the postscript. Okay, so imagine society as this set of interlinked markets, essentially, about what is valued and what's not valued, right? It's not just companies on, the Dow Jones. It's the words we use. It's what we think and what we do. Also has this kind of stock price structure. This is what Deleuze says in the postscript, that more and more everything is going to have this kind of fluid exchange rate type of structure. So it's really interesting because in some ways digital culture today is laying bare the underlying mechanics of how things in society are valued and how those processes work. At the time of someone like Diogenes, obviously information moves much slower. By the way, for people who don't know, Diogenes is a figure in ancient Greece. He's a very strange philosopher associated with the school known as the Cynics, the ancient Cynics, and that means something very different than what we mean by cynicism, just to be clear. And so in that time period, in that time and place, obviously information moved way slower, right? You don't have this like highly decentralized, integrated social markets like we have on social media today. You had people who saw each other at like the local town square, the local marketplace or whatever. That's about it. And so the concept of defacing the currency to Diogenes, as I understand it, at least in my interpretation of it, is that, at any given time, there are certain norms and fashions that are powerful and influential and valued, and everyone thinks they're cool and good and right. But whatever those values are at any particular point in time are probably going to be really hypocritical in any kind of modern Western society. And essentially, ancient Greece is kind of the first Western society. It's the first kind of bourgeois society in some sense. You had, you have classes and you have an economy, and there are high class citizens and low class citizens, and a major distinction between slaves and merchants and then the aristocrats. So pretty much all of kind of modern bourgeois. And technically, okay, if you're a historian, like technically what they call like modern bourgeois society comes later, obviously, yeah. but all of the basic ingredients for what will become what we call modern bourgeois society, all of the basic ingredients are really there for the first time in a very undeveloped way in ancient Greece. Okay, and so a defining characteristic of bourgeois society is this differential or discrepancy between the public face that you put on and then the private reality of who you really are. This is Norbert Elias and the Rise of Manners. If you want to read Norbert Elias, pretty much what defines modernity, what defines modern life as we know it, what defines bourgeois life is by definition hypocrisy. It's modern manners, right? It's you go to a dinner party and you look really nice. You're wearing fancy clothes. You use sophisticated language. When in fact, when you go to bed at night, you scratch your ass and you pee in a bucket like a dog, right? Like at the end of the day, you're not really the polished thing that you present to the world. That's a defining characteristic of what modern society is, okay? And it's just starting off in ancient Greece. So Diogenes was basically the first person to say all of what is normally valued by normal people is essentially dishonest. It's intrinsically deceptive. And because of that, there's always going to be disequilibrium in what is actually true and what is actually valued. In other words, the true valuation of things in a modern bourgeois society is always going to be other than the one that reigns. Like the reigning valuation of things, the reigning current stock prices, as I was saying before, of various phenomena or practices or ideas or words, that which reigns is always going to be off from the true one, what it really should be if everything was adequately and correctly measured and calibrated and valued correctly.
Yeah, and you can make a lot of money betting against it.
Right. Well, that's interesting, and that's something we could pick that apart too. In a way, that's kind of what I'm doing. But let me just finish this
Sure.
little bit of explanation. Sorry if I'm being a little long-winded. It is complicated, honestly, and every time I talk about it, I get a little bit further. I make a little bit more progress in really connecting all of the dots. So I'm really doing real thinking for you, honestly here, transparently. So the what Diogenes says is that one should. The solution to this, in other words, is to what he called deface the currency. And what Diogenes did was he basically went around and did what we would think of today as essentially publicity stunts or kind of just absurd provocations. Mm-hmm. Basically, performance art really is truly what it was. He's known for many things like, you'd run around the marketplace in daylight with a lamp, and people would ask him, "What are you doing, dude?" And he would say, "I'm looking for a man." Basically just utterly insulting the absolute hypocrisy of everyone around him in this just absurdly aggressive, militant gadfly type of way. It's kind of like, Socrates the gadfly, but on drugs in this like crazy aggressive way. And yeah, but also so people generally hated him. He was very annoying, obviously. And he lived like an animal, he'd masturbate in public. Do all types of these very animalistic things. But what he's doing is he's actually laying bare the reality of the human beast. He's actually being honest in being this kind of terrible, aggressive, animalistic, insane provocateur. All he's actually doing is being himself and revealing basic human drives that bourgeois modern man suppresses and hides and mutilates. Okay, and so that's his philosophical operation, and he would call it, defacing the currency, precisely because of everything I've laid out in terms of the kind of exchange rate society that Deleuze describes. The idea is that when you lay bare the truth in a kind of provocative, performative way, and in particular when it causes you some punishment, like when normal people look at you and think you're crazy or dumb or stupid. And it's because you're laying bare something that everyone else has agreed to lie about. When that happens, by definition, or not by definition, but rather this is a reliable, reproducible political mechanism, I would argue. When you perform this operation of defacing the currency, you're not trying to persuade anyone. You're not trying to convince anyone. You don't need anyone to approve you or like you or accept you. What's radical about this operation of defacing currency is that to use Deleuzian language, you're jamming the cybernetic control structures. You're introducing a virus into the current valuation of things, to the current kind of exchange rate cybernetic control structures that Deleuze describes. With your behaviors, you're putting into that system of valuation mechanisms that literally cannot be stopped because they don't require anyone to support you or agree with you. You're actually operating directly on people's perceptions of what is real and what isn't real. That's the idea of defacing the currency, according to Diogenes. That's why he performed these insane, absurd philosophical provocations and what we would essentially call performance art. Because by doing that, when you kind of take the heat and people just hate you for it or whatever, but nonetheless you're exposing the certain realities, certain truths. You're putting them out there, whether people like it or not. You can't unhear that, right? You can't unsee that stuff. You're actually changing what has power and what doesn't have power, because you have to remember that also, Alexander the Great, for instance, said that if he could not be Alexander, he would be Diogenes.
Yes.
So what on earth is going on there? Why would the most powerful person at the time say that if he could not be himself, he would be this madman, homeless guy who runs around naked, masturbating, and doing insane performance art that just upsets everyone? Why would Alexander the Great want to be Diogenes if he could not be Alexander the Great? And it's exactly because of what I'm saying, that someone like Diogenes is truly, concretely powerful because he's living well. He's living a simple life, and he's not suffering from any of the kind of the tortures of bourgeois hypocrisy. And he's actually so powerful that he can afford for huge numbers of people to hate him. He can afford for a society to look down on him and make fun of him. That is a sign of true power. So because that is a sign of true power, it's a credible signal. In other words, it's a costly signal of what true power is. Because of that, the truths that Diogenes lays bare cannot be ignored by other people. They can say they hate Diogenes, but they cannot deny, they cannot unhear or unsee the truth that he is laying bare in his philosophical provocations. That's what he meant by defacing the currency, and I believe that is what Deleuze meant when he talks in the postscript about jamming, piracy, and viruses.
Wow, well, that was fantastic. I was going to ask you one more question, but I think I'm just going to leave it there. Let the listeners.
If you don't mind a brief answer, you can go ahead and ask it.
Oh, well, okay. So I'll give you my last question here. Although I do want to compliment you real quick for thinking out loud there. In Todd May's book on Deleuze, he says the central question for Deleuze is how one might live. What's your answer to that?
Oh, you broke up.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll repeat. In Todd May's book on Deleuze, he says Deleuze's central question is how one might live. What's your answer to that question?
Mm-hmm. I think that's right. I think that's totally right. And my answer is that in the most based way possible. I think that's essentially what I'm trying to summarize with my kind of basedness. And I guess if you want to know more about what I mean by that, you have to read the book.
Great. Thank you so much, Justin. You can read Justin's other work and get connected with the rest of the work that he's doing over at theotherlifenow.com. You can hear his takes on things as well as the other guests that he interviews on the Other Life podcast, as well as get a hold of his ebook, Based Deleuze, both in PDF form as well as audiobook and in paperback on Amazon. You can find him on Twitter at JMRPHY. Justin, anything else for the listeners before we let you go?
Oh, no, I just want to say thank you for the thoughtful questions, and thank you for your interest in my work. Actually, if I haven't plugged enough, I'll just quickly also say that I'm doing a course, a proper online course on Deleuze versus Heidegger with my colleague and collaborator, Johannes Niederhauser, who's a PhD and scholar of Heidegger. So it's a cool little course. There's more than 6 hours of lecture videos, and matter of fact, we're currently launching a live seminar cohort. So if this is something that you're interested in actually talking about with other people and want to check out the course,
great. Well, fantastic.
You should be able to Google it.
Fantastic. So I'll just leave you.
You broke up. Sorry.
Oh, yeah. I don't know why the connection is bugging out here at the end of the conversation. I'm really sorry about it.
Yeah, it's all good. I don't know if it's me or you. Sorry though. Either way.
One last thing I'll just leave you with is a quote from Deleuze's essay in the postscript. There is no need to fear or hope, but only to look for new weapons. Justin Murphy, it's been a pleasure.
Hell yeah.
See ya.
Thanks so much, man.
Yep.
I'll be in touch with you.